This is a 2015 all-wheel drive Chevy Traverse. In today's video, I'm going to share some of the major problems that this Chevy Traverse has with only 120,000 miles on it. And I'm going to try to test and fix one of the major problems that, if we don't correct, could cost this vehicle a new transmission. The first thing I want to do is get this thing started and show you guys a couple of the issues that it has. There aren't any problems starting the Traverse, but once it's started, it does have a few issues. This Traverse does have its check engine light on, and it also has some issues with the tire pressure monitoring system, telling me to change the engine oil soon, and I also have the hood open. The first problem with this Traverse is it has manual steering, so I'm trying to turn that steering and it's not going anywhere. Occasionally the power steering works here. This has already had the power steering pump replaced twice, and it's about to get its third power steering pump. The biggest issue with this Traverse is it doesn't go into reverse unless you rev it up. So I shifted into reverse and give it a little bit of gas, and you see the engine just revs up and nothing's gonna happen. But if I rev it up high enough to hit 2,000, it's gonna shift into reverse. Okay, so in that case, it was 3,000 RPM. So now we're in reverse and the vehicle goes backwards, no problem. What that leads me to believe is I have a problem with one of the shift solenoids. So what I'm gonna do is pull this vehicle up into the driveway where I have a nice clear place to work, and we're gonna open up the front of the transmission and see if we can test the solenoids. Oh, power steering. What I'm looking for today is going to be directly below the air box. So this is where your air filter is. This is your air intake. And below that, you have your transmission dipstick and fill. And then in front of that, towards the rear of the vehicle, is your shift linkage. Well, there's this plastic cover right here, and it has 6 to 8 bolts on it. And behind this plastic cover are your shift solenoids. There are 7 shift solenoids in there. And what we're going to do is remove this cover, remove the solenoids, and test them with a volt-ohm meter. If my thoughts about this vehicle are correct, we can simply replace one of those solenoids that's bad, and then the vehicle will run good after that. So the two issues that I know of with this transmission so far are it doesn't go into reverse unless you rev it up, and then it has problems shifting between second and third gear. Because of that, I believe I'm gonna have issues with at least 2 of the solenoids under that plastic cover. If I can replace 1 or 2 of those solenoids costing between $100 and $200 a piece, that cost will be significantly lower than the cost to replace the entire transmission. Revving the engine up like that to get into reverse can cause serious transmission damage and even possibly break something like a motor mount. That's something we really don't want to have to deal with when we can just make a simple fix. Before I crack open this transmission, let me know a couple things in the comments. First, do you think that the shift solenoid is something you can easily fix in your driveway, or is this something that you would have to pay a mechanic to diagnose and correct? I suspect the cost to do something like this job will be upwards of at least $1,000, and that's if the mechanic doesn't just try to sell you a transmission directly. I'm gonna throw some ramps under it, but having the ramps under it might make it harder to reach the top. Hopefully I don't rip this lip off, but I'll leave it there for now. It's already been dragged a little bit. Now I'm just gonna pull it up. Now that I have the ramp set in place, I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that the tires are fully to the front of the ramps. Then I'm gonna set the parking brake, and then I'm gonna set it in park. You don't want the vehicle to fall on you, so make sure you set that parking brake. And if possible, chalk your back wheels so the vehicle doesn't roll backwards if someone just happens to hop in while you're under it and start it up. So I'm under the vehicle, the front of the vehicle is this way, the engine is this way. And what I have here is the transmission. There's not really a pan like an old school transmission pan. What this is a drain plug, and this plastic cover is kind of on level with this drain plug. This very small bolt right here is the transmission drain plug. What that means to me is I need to drain the transmission fluid before I remove this cover. Otherwise, I'll have a huge mess on my hand once I crack this and stuff just starts leaking everywhere. While I'm under here, I see at least 1, 2, 3, hopefully you guys can see that, 4, 5. So I'm gonna assume 6, 7, and then 8, 9. So I'm thinking I have 9, maybe 10 bolts on this cover to remove it. So a couple of tips I have before you get started is, one, if you are going to be messing around like this for a day, put on like a black t-shirt if you have that. That way if you do get dirty and you have to wash your hands and clean up, any kind of oil and grease stains aren't that noticeable when you're moving around. And my second tip is, if you don't have a nice garage to work in, like I don't have right here, I have gravel everywhere. So I'm gonna find a giant cardboard box to lay on. That'll keep my shirt from absorbing all the gravel, and it'll just keep me feeling fresh as I'm rolling around on the ground down there. So I'm going to try this 12mm socket for the drain plug for the transmission. 12 is just a little loose, so I'll try the 11, and it might actually be standard as well. To open this transmission drain plug, I'm going to use this 11mm socket. And remember, lefty loosey, righty tighty, even when you're upside down. Okay, so we're down to a little bit of a drip. I'll go ahead and throw this drain plug back in. I think it's magnetic, so. Now this drain plug is clean because the last time I was here, I did a drain and fill of about 7 quarts. This transmission fluid isn't that old, but I'm definitely not gonna reuse it because it might get hair, dust, debris, whatever in it, and I don't need that going into the transmission. Otherwise, why would I even mess with it if I'm just gonna put more stuff in it and ruin it? This is a very interesting drain plug that they have here. It's almost like a self-locking, threaded drain plug that once you get it in, like there's no need to crank it down super tight. I can feel it kind of in there now, and I think that's good enough. It is dripping a little bit. I do think that the cover will drip a little bit when I get it open, but it's not something that bothers me too much. Now I want to get this transmission fluid out from under here without draining it everywhere. I think there was about 7 quarts that came out, and so this pan is a 5-quart pan, and there's my mess. And that's why I took my cardboard out, so I don't get that cardboard dirty. All right, I'm just gonna move this out of the way and try to lose as little bit of that as possible so I can get it ready to get recycled. I won't be able to put that fluid up until I put the new fluid in, and I'm gonna put this fluid in the container from the new fluid. So I'm about to start pulling the bolts out of that cover, and I'm gonna keep a couple things in mind. If the bolts aren't all the same, I want to make sure I know where the different bolts came from. And if I have something like a metal, one of those magnetic trays, I definitely want to use something like that because I don't want my bolts to get lost in the gravel. And maybe for some reason I'm finishing this job up in the dark and my bolts go everywhere, and then I won't be able to finish until the next day. So sometimes when I'm under these cars working on them, I start to question my choices in life. What else could I be doing with my time? All right, lefty loosey, righty tighty. I want to make sure I'm not putting these bolts in any tighter because that cover is plastic. So we're in luck. It seems like we got some magnetic trays. I'm going to use these. I'm going to use, do we got 2 of them there? Yeah. I'm going to use both of them. If I have different kinds of bolts, I'll put one in one tray and one in the other. Not absolutely mandatory because obviously you can see which ones are bigger and which ones are smaller. The more organization you have at the beginning, the better. Some people will actually make like a cardboard cutout. Unfortunately, I don't really know how this cover looks, so I can't make a cardboard cutout. When I finish up the job later, I'm going to reuse the gasket that's on the cover now. It's a reusable gasket. I'm assuming you could probably replace it, but as we can see, we might already have a little leakage here anyway, so it's not something I'm gonna lose any sleep over. I'm moving towards the driver's side. There's some more bolts under there, and I have these 2 little trim fittings. I don't have the proper trim remover, so hopefully I can get these out. They're really just a pain. I got one out. It'll be good enough to use again when we're done with the job. I'll go ahead and put that in my little parts tray. Hopefully I don't lose it. If I do, I'll just cut this piece off. I'm never gonna use it again. So I've got that off, and I'm gonna show you in there. Now I have good access to the remaining 4 bolts on this side. Right here I pulled off 1, 2, and 3 bolts on the top, and now I've got 2 more there on the side down here I can get to with my hands easily, but I can't see them with the camera very easily. There's 1, there's 2, and the 3rd one you can just barely see. It also looks like it's the most complicated. It has another one of those kind of long bolts with a nut on it, but there's actually 2 nuts on this, so I think I might have to take the first nut off, move whatever that is out of the way, and then take the second nut off. So I'm on the last bolt. I'm not gonna be able to show you guys, but I can tell it's the last bolt because as I'm loosening it, the cover itself is actually starting to get loose. So I think once this bolt is off, this cover will just pop right out. And there's nothing too difficult here. Like I'm not There are some wild angles, so be creative as you're getting in here. But besides getting into these wild angles, there's really nothing so difficult that I can't just do it with my own two hands in this small 10mm socket. I am on the hardest bolt right now. It's the furthest from my arms, and it also had a power steering hose clamp on it that I had to pull off, but it's coming out pretty easy, and in a couple of turns here I'll have it out completely. So the good news is all of the bolts are kind of self-explanatory where they go. You have a couple that have the extensions on them, and those match up where there are fittings. And in most cases, you know, if you're already, let's see what we got here. All right, got the last one out. So move the camera because I already got it soaked in transmission fluid before. We got the cover off, wasn't too big of a hassle. I did end up having to take the top half of the air box off in the engine bay. Not a super difficult task, but let's go through and count. I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 total bolts to pull off. And now I'm going to pull the valve body off. There's my valve body right there. There's going to be some 10 and 8mm bolts I need to pull off. And I did have to pull this air box off to slide that cover out. I'm just going to set this somewhere out of the way safe so I don't ruin it while I'm working. And now I'm going to make my way from the top to the bottom by pulling off first all the 10mm bolts and then all the 8mm bolts. And when I'm done, the valve body should slide right out. There's also a couple of little electrical connectors I have to undo, and I want to make sure I don't rip any cables while I'm pulling this out. Okay, so here I am about an hour later. I was messing with these bolts. There's 4 8mm bolts, and they go along the kind of center of this thing. And then one of these is actually a 10mm. And then there's also 7 10mm bolts. So total there's 11 bolts, 4 plus 7. 4 of them are an 8mm head, and then 7 of them are a 10mm head. This thing was a pain to get out, but as you can see, I didn't have to take the front end off. I didn't have to remove the radiator. All I had to do was remove the air box so far. And hopefully I'll be able to put it back together. So we ended up just replacing the entire valve body. I took the valve body off on Monday and I started to check the solenoids, and the kind of valve body that we have was non-modular, meaning that we couldn't pull off the individual solenoids and replace them. This is the old valve body right here, and normally in the older vehicles you'd be able to take the solenoids out from the valve body. Maybe you can see them right here. Let's see. You can take these out. We tested them. They actually all tested good. And I suspect with this Tecum that there are 2 seals in here that were probably bad, but we went ahead and just replaced the whole thing while we were in there. The repair kit for this is about $100, and it comes with the 2 seals and all the little rubber grommets for all the fluid flow in here. What we ended up doing was just replacing the whole thing. We were in there, we want to get it done. So I did reset the engine codes, and right now we are adding the transmission fluid back in. So now I've got to do a relearn procedure for the new Tecum. The relearn procedure involves turning on the vehicle for 3 minutes, then turning it off for a minute, turning it back on for 3 minutes, and once the engine idle gets down to the proper idle, then it should be relearned. This Tecum that we got came from a company, and they pre-programmed the Tecum to the VIN number before they sent it to us. So that's a huge plus. Otherwise, we would have had to take the vehicle to a dealer or use an MDI programmer to program the new Tecum to this vehicle. In 1 minute, I'll start it back up, and hopefully it'll go into reverse with no problems. Moment of truth. I've got this thing. I took the brake off. We have the fluid in there. We just replaced the valve body. And is it in reverse? Okay, so the transmission did have that kind of high RPM shift into reverse, but it didn't just jack down into reverse like it did at the beginning of the video. So we're gonna go drive around and see if we can reset the fluid, maybe get some fluid flow in there, check the fluid on a flat surface, and then hopefully we'll be fixed up. So that's the most frustrating thing about working on these General Motors transmissions. In this case, this transmission gave me some codes that led me to believe that the rear shift solenoid and the 2 to 3 shift solenoids were bad on the Tecum or transmission control module. I ended up pulling the transmission control module out, checking those solenoids. None of them actually read bad. Then I decided to go ahead and replace the entire Tecum unit for about $400. I put the vehicle back together and the transmission is still not shifting into reverse as it's supposed to, and it's not making good shifts between 2 and 3. So upon further research, I have found out that there are problems with something called a wave plate within this transmission, and the wave plate controls the shifts into reverse, third, and fifth gears. What that means is this vehicle will unfortunately require either a complete transmission overhaul or a just replacement of the transmission. So this video really demonstrates my frustration with General Motors transmissions or Chevy transmissions in general. If you have a Chevy Traverse or another vehicle with one of these 4T60 or 4T75 transmissions in it, first of all, I recommend you change your fluid much more than you might think you're supposed to. This vehicle only has 120,000 miles, and I believe that this is a really premature transmission failure for a vehicle of this generation.